How much is the Death Note really worth? The Death Note is easily one of the most overpowered weapons in anime history, yet its value has never been given much attention. And it should, as the Death Note is easily one of the most valuable items in all of anime. Hello everyone, as always, I'm that anime theorist Jordan, the only AniTuber who can skip filler with my left hand and read manga with my right. And yes, I may even take a potato chip and eat it. Even if you like Death Note just for that scene alone, you have to admit it's one of the best crime anime to ever exist. And that's all thanks to the Death Note, which is one of the most unique weapons in all of anime. In a genre packed to the brim with swords, the Death Note shines a light of the potential for creative weapons and powers. With a weapon this powerful, I started to question, how much is a weapon like the Death Note even worth? Well, to formally appraise this item, we need to act like appraisers ourselves. Yes, I love vintage wine and steak. If you can't already tell, I had no idea what appraisers did before researching them. Honestly, I thought they just pointed at things and yelled the biggest number they could think of. Okay, but seriously, appraisers do have a formal methodology for evaluating the price of an object. So today we're going to be using the 3 best techniques of professional appraisers to help determine the true value of the Death Note. Starting off, let's talk about the cost approach, or what it would cost to replicate the item. So what we need to ask ourselves is, how do we make a Death Note? I mean, couldn't we just summon a Shinigami and retrieve the Death Note that way? Well, while Shinigami do exist in Japanese folklore, and the authors Tsugumi Oba and Takashi Obata stayed true to the legend of the Japanese equivalent of Grim Reapers, they did add the concept of the Death Note for the method of killing. So unfortunately, we can't have our own Death Note. But that doesn't stop us from bothering Ryuk. Hi, Ryuk.
What are you doing here?
Hi, Ryuk.
Quit following me.
Hi, Ryuk. Anyhow, considering we can't get our Death Note directly from the source, how much would it cost to create a human equivalent? Well, my first thought is to match the Death Note's abilities with our current military forces. I mean, the US military costs about $1 trillion to run, so we could just settle on that and call it a day, right? But that includes a significant amount of redundancies, salaries, and other weapons that we don't really need in our calculations. What we really need is one weapon. Alright, so what about a Black Hawk or a drone? I mean, a drone will only set you back about $25 million. Compared to the full military budget of the US, that's a steal. But we need to remember that these weapons are a massive overkill. Okay, bad jokes aside, missiles and bombs are pretty excessive. The Death Note is actually a really efficient method of killing, completing targeted attacks with no additional loss of life. Honestly, there is really nothing out there that has the same level of efficiency. So while it isn't ideal, for now we'll have to settle with the cost of a drone as a suitable replacement. But thankfully, we still have our other 2 approaches for appraising the Death Note. Let's move on to the sales approach, or how much the product has already sold for. Surprisingly, this has actually been done before, but I don't remember Light ever selling the Death Note. Well, in 2020, the creators of Death Note released a one-shot chapter in Shonen Jump showing this very scenario, but instead of Light, the one-shot featured a new owner of the Death Note, Murano Takanaka. After receiving the Death Note and deliberating, Tanaka decided to sell it to the highest bidder on Twitter of all places. Well, isn't that a blast from the past? Congrats, Elon, on ruining part of Death Note history. Initially, the bids ranged from millions to billions of dollars from private buyers, but the bids quickly skyrocketed, with companies pooling money and entire countries attempting to purchase the Death Note. And as the dust settles over the auction, the final winner of the Death Note was, of course, the United States. Hell yeah, brother. USA! 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 Anyhow, the buyer at the time, President Donald Trump, shelled out over $10 trillion for ownership over the Death Note. So that's it then. You can buy the Death Note for $10 trillion, right? Well, there's something I forgot to mention. Word of the sale reached the Shikigami King, who was not pleased with these unprecedented circumstances. He ended up creating a new rule before the sale could be completed, stating that anyone who bought or sold the Death Note would die. When Ryuk arrived at the White House, he relayed this new rule to Trump, leading him to reject the ownership of the Death Note to avoid the same fate as the seller, Tanaka. So if you were ever planning on buying or selling the Death Note, it's essentially worthless. But we're not trying to do that. We're just trying to determine the value of the Death Note. And this brings us to our last approach, the income approach, which helps us identify the potential value to be gained from the Death Note, or how much can you earn from the Death Note over time. Oddly enough, we actually have seen users of the Death Note be business-oriented. After Light was almost caught, he gave up ownership and asked Rem to pass on the Death Note to someone who desired wealth and power. Rem ended up choosing Higuchi, the head of technology and development at Yotsuba. He, along with other high-ranking members of the Yotsuba group, made selective killings to benefit the company and consequently their salaries. While it's unclear of all of the actions they've taken, we know a few. For instance, they planned on killing a member of the Kiwasawa group who opposed their resort development plans. Additionally, they planned on killing individuals at ELF Insurance, a company threatening to expand into their market. While this doesn't provide concrete evidence for the potential financial gain of using the Death Note, we know that actions like these substantially increase their salaries. Now, I hate to say this, but they could have been even greedier. But I get it. They're already killing people for financial gain. How much greedier could you get? Well, they were using the Death Note entirely for the sake of protecting the Yotsuba company, and not for personal gain. Why not short the stock of a growing company after killing its CEO? Or start investing heavily in end-of-life services after increasing the world's death total? As uncomfortable as these thoughts might be, they could easily make the owner of the Death Note a millionaire, or even a billionaire. So then with all of these different approaches, how do we determine the value of the Death Note? In all honesty, if there was never a sale of the Death Note, it would be pretty easy to say it's priceless. I mean, you have an object literally from purgatory. But the Death Note was sold and a precedent was established even if we can't sell it. Therefore, it becomes the appraiser's job to balance the cost to replicate, the potential income, and the sale price of the item. Well, we learned there is very little that can perfectly replicate the Death Note, so we'll have to ignore those figures. But honestly, they were peanuts compared to the other two approaches. Although the sale technically never occurred, the demand for the item is present, so we can partially factor this into our final calculations. This leaves us with the income approach, which is ambiguous and variable compared to evaluating the income from a piece of property. But if we assume the owner of the Death Note has little conscience and is well educated like Higuchi, it wouldn't be a stretch to assume they could earn $500 million to $1 billion. Factoring in the demand for the Death Note, we can assume its value is on the higher end of that estimate. So with all that in mind, we can officially say that the Death Note is worth $800 million. Think of all the potato chips you could buy with that kind of paper. But if you don't want to buy anything, you could check out my video on the true value of a hunter's license for free, where we investigate its true value like we did for the Death Note. And with that, thanks for watching and stay curious.